righty, let's take our Bibles tonight, turn to the book of Esther, chapter number 7. And I'm going to go ahead, typically on Wednesday nights I don't read through the chapter, but I want to do it on purpose tonight because I want you to ask yourself, how does this help me in my life? What can I do that's found in this chapter that is... How is this practical at all? Because I honestly believe, you know what, the day is going to come, probably in about 55 years when I'm dead and gone. The one thing that I want to leave behind for my church is my people learn how to read their Bibles and get something out of it for everyday living. That, I think, is the most important thing that I can do. To take the Bible, read it, and grab something that you can put into practice for today. Let's take a look at this chapter, beginning at verse number 1. So the king and Haman came to banquet with Esther the queen. And the king said unto Esther on the second day at the banquet of wine, What is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? And it shall be performed even to the half of the kingdom. Then Esther the queen answered and said, If I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given at my petition, and my people at my request. For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. Then the king Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, Who is he, and where is he that durst presume in his heart to do so? And Esther said, The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. And Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. And the king, arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, went into the palace garden. And Haman stood up to make request for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. Then the king returned out of the palace garden into the place of the banquet of wine. And Haman was fallen upon the bed whereon Esther was. Then said the king, Will he force the queen also before me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. And Harbona, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, Behold also the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king, standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, Hang him thereon. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. What does that have to do with us? You get up in the morning, your devotion schedule brings you to this chapter. You take the time to read it before you begin the day. What are we supposed to get out of this? I want to bring a message this evening on the subject, how to see the hand of God. At West Point, there are numerous classes taught that deal with the art of warfare. These candidates are at West Point to learn how to become a warrior, a leader of men, officers one day that will be leading their troops into combat. For that reason, historical battles and commanders are placed under a magnifying glass so that every detail of a military campaign can be torn apart, examined, studied. What did they do right? What did they do wrong? What was it that cost them the battle? How did they win this war? At West Point, there's one famous omission, one battle that is probably one of the greatest in modern history, but that is a battle that has been undiscussed on purpose. The missing war in the curriculum at West Point has to do with what is called the Six-Day War that was fought in 1967. And the reason that one particular war was omitted is because West Point is interested in facts, not miracles. So what happened back in 1967 that caused the world to sit up and take notice, and it even caused lost people to realize that miracles had in fact taken place? It came about on Israel's Independence Day, kind of like our 4th of July. Theirs had taken place 19 years before that, when the nation came back from the grave Israel was brought back from the dead. Israel had watched 4 nations in particular create a massive amount of weapons and soldiers that were now aligning themselves on the borders of Israel. If these 4 nations attacked, Israel would be facing an army that was twice their size, if not larger. As tensions mounted, the Jewish people began to describe their situation as the Second Holocaust. City parks throughout the nation of Israel were designated as future cemeteries for the bloodbath that they knew was going to come. And then Israel did something that caught the world off guard, something that was totally unpredictable. Nobody even imagined it. Instead of waiting to be attacked, Israel attacked first. Their preemptive strike caught the Egyptians off guard to such a degree that not a single Egyptian aircraft ever launched. They were all destroyed on the runway. In less than 12 hours, Israel had demolished and destroyed the Egyptian Air Force completely. The reason was not because of the hotshot Israeli pilots. It was simply because Jordan and Egypt shared information. Jordan sent a message, a secret coded message to the Egyptians, notifying them that Israel was on the verge of launching a strike. The Egyptians never got the message because both nations had changed the code a couple days before, and Egypt could not decipher the text. So they were caught off guard, totally unprepared. Because of the first strike, confusion characterized the armies of those 4 nations. As the Israeli army was entering the city of Shechem, which was occupied by the Arabs, they were prepared for a bloodbath, for a bloody engagement. As they entered the city on the main road, they saw the civilians waving white handkerchiefs. They were being welcomed. This was an enemy city. And yet it's almost like a parade is going on. The Israelis are dumbfounded. Why is there no fighting? Why is everybody so friendly? They made their way into the city, and one shot rang out, and that's when the population of that city and the enemy soldiers holding their guns realized these were Israeli troops, not the Iraqis they were expecting. Caught off guard. The city was captured without even any fighting taking place. On another occasion, there was a Syrian tank commander who surrendered his division of tanks to a tiny group of 12 Israeli tanks. The Israeli tanks are heading toward what they knew was a suicide mission. This thing is going to be horrible. All of these enemy tanks, and we only got 12? As they approached this division of Syrian tanks, the commander came out and surrendered. Why? He later admitted that he saw a mirage and he saw hundreds of Israeli tanks. An entire division. Not a single shot fired. On another occasion, Israeli soldiers were making their way to an Egyptian stronghold. As they were getting near, they heard explosions taking place. There was already a major battle taking place. They made their way to that location and saw that it had been abandoned. All of the Egyptian equipment had been destroyed. They found out later that the Egyptians heard that they were coming, and they were stricken with fear of these Israelis, and so they destroyed their own equipment and disappeared. Now, the problem that they have at West Point to explain the Six-Day War is that they're not supposed to get into miracles. They're trying to find some military genius. They're trying to find some well-trained soldiers. Yeah, everybody wants to know how in the world the Israelis, who were outsized and outgunned by 2-1, how in the world could they have won? The answer is, on a human level, there is no explanation. Well, listen to this quote that was printed and found in a secular newspaper. It said this: "Even a non-religious person must admit this war was fought with help from heaven." Lost people, West Pointers, and the world as a whole don't like to admit it, but there are some things that happen down here that you have to admit God did it. What we find in this chapter is Esther being in a place where she can actually see the invisible hand of God moving her in her life and in the lives of her people. So the question is, what did she do to be able to see the hand of God move in such an effective, powerful way that not only her life was spared, but also every Jew in the kingdom? Beginning at verse number 1, circle the word banquet in this verse, and the first thing is this. And folks, I'm telling you, don't forget, we're getting practical tonight. What that means is this is not going to be rocket scientist stuff. The first thing that Esther did that allowed her to see the hand of God move, she waited for just the right moment. So the king and Haman came to banquet with Esther the queen. And the king said again unto Esther on the second day at the banquet of wine, "What is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? And it shall be performed even to the half of the kingdom." Now Esther had already scheduled and held an earlier banquet. Things did not line up to where she felt comfortable. She never said anything about what the problem was or why she was wanting to hold a banquet. As we come to this passage right here, we're dealing with the second banquet. And the reason that there was a second banquet was because of the timing. I have for years made this recommendation to married couples about how and when to discuss things that are very significant and important in their marriage. And that is, instead of becoming angry and bringing up this problem when emotions are running high, the better solution is to pick a time and a place and discuss it when both people are doing okay. When exactly is a good time? Is it a Saturday? Is it a Tuesday night? When is a good time? A good time is when both people are in a good mood to talk, and they have plenty of time to talk things out. And I say plenty of time for this reason. You're better off, if you're married tonight, you're better off going without an entire night of sleep and facing a new day, relying upon God to give you that renewed strength and work things out instead of going to bed mad. So what does it take for this to happen, this right time, this right moment? It boils down to something that it's easy to know and it's tough to follow through on. And that is patience. It comes down to a willingness to bite our tongue when we want to say something. And rather than starting a fight, we just kind of bide our time to make sure that we can have a controlled conversation where things will be accomplished other than exchanging harsh words. Verse number 3. A second thing that Esther did that allowed her to see God do something really miraculous. She made a request instead of a demand. Circle the request, last word in that verse. Then Esther the queen answered and said, If I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given at my petition, and my people at my request. Now, it's easy to understand why she did so, because even though she's the queen, she happens to be married to the most powerful man in the kingdom, and this guy had the power of life and death. Persian kings had so much power at their disposal, they came to the place where they would almost look upon themselves as if they were a god. Ahasuerus historically is also known as Xerxes. The man had already gotten rid of one queen. Esther didn't have the slightest idea how long she might be around. She had already dared to barge in on him without being called for, which was automatic death penalty unless he forgave the intrusion. In other words, she would have been a fool who would not have lived very long to make demands of this husband and king. But there's more to it than that. You ready for this? A request is being nice. A demand is not always. Marriage is not the place or the relationship that can handle very many demands. And what will always work better is the kind of relationship that involves compromise. Demands, compromise. One of the worst documents ever written was the Versailles Treaty that brought an end to World War I. In the Versailles Treaty was found nothing but demands. This document placed a wagon load of demands upon a conquered people, upon conquered Germany. And what happened because of the Versailles Treaty was that Germany had a bad attitude, and every German had a lot of discontent. One thing that this treaty included was called the guilt clause. In order for there to be peace, and by the way, they were only given 24 hours to accept this. If they did not accept it within 24 hours, troops would march in and the fighting would start all over. 24 hours, and they were given to accept the guilt clause. And what that meant was, we, the German people, accept 100% of the blame. Every death, every casualty, every bit of destroyed property, it is all our fault. The Versailles Treaty demanded an enormous amount of money to be paid back to the Allied nations. The problem was, there was no dollar amount given at the time. They just had to agree to pay the bill. The bill came to such an impossible amount, it could never have been repaid by Germany, but that did not matter. Portions of the German Empire were chopped up and given to other nations. The Versailles Treaty brought about the existence of Poland and Czechoslovakia. The one country that wanted to squeeze blood out of the turnip more than any other was the nation of France. France wanted Germany to pay for all of the damages and all of the deaths. Add up all of the demands, And you can halfway understand why Germany was more than willing to listen and to follow someone like Adolf Hitler. Demands can be very dangerous. They can lead to resentment, and they'll backfire more times than they'll be beneficial. And therefore, Esther, being led of the Holy Spirit, had enough sense in order to bring about the necessary changes that's going to help me as an individual and help my people. Honey, I'd like to make a request. Not stomping her foot, not slamming the door, not demanding anything. She's making progress, and she'll see God's hand move because she had enough sense to make a request. Verse number 4. Third thing tonight is this. She had all of her ducks in a row. She was not caught off guard. She was not unprepared. Listen to this in verse 4. She says, "For we are sold." How did she know that? "For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed." Well, how did she know that? To be slain and to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I'd held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. How did she know that? For all of those people who come to a bewildering time in their lives when they're facing a lot of unknowns, they're reaching a time in their life when they feel so overwhelmed that all they can think is, I don't know what to do. I'm about to give a great piece of advice that I'm getting from a very godly woman. And that advice is, do something. Do something. Don't just sit there and feel sorry for yourself. Do something. When someone comes to me with a problem, I'll sometimes start asking them some questions. When I do, I usually get one of two responses. One response is, I don't know. How's your health? I don't know. How's your finances? I don't know. What are you going to do? I don't know. Or else when I ask questions, and I'm asking questions not to put them on the spot, I'm asking questions to get information so I can help them. And then sometimes I'll have somebody that I'm talking to, and they've come in for some counseling and some help, and I'll start asking questions, and they start rattling off information. Well, I got on the internet and I checked the symptoms that I'm feeling, and it looks like it could be this or it might be that. Or well, this is exactly what I owe, or this is how much I have on a credit card. Oh, what's the interest rate? The interest rate is 18%. Do you see a difference here? You're drowning in debt, is that right? Yes. What's the interest rate on your credit card? I don't know. If you're drowning in debt, does it not help to know how quickly you're going to drown? You see the difference? They might not know how to get out of debt, but the fact that they know it's 18%, that's a big difference. Now, if they don't know the answers to these questions, then I point them in a direction to where they can find out. And that way they know how bad they're bleeding financially. Or they're getting an awareness of how badly they're hurting physically. If it's a health problem, then I'll point them in a direction so that they can start tracking this stuff down on their own because they need to. I don't have the time to. They need to do that. I'll point them in a financial direction, and I'll point them towards some help. And that way, they now have a place to start looking for a solution. And the starting point to getting our ducks in a row must begin with God. That's where we start. Meaning, preacher, I don't know what to do. I might not ask, but I'm wondering, have you been praying about this thing? Have you spent any time maybe fasting and praying? Are you spending more time in the Bible? Are you climbing up into God's lap? You see, sometimes what we do is we just kind of throw our hands up and feel sorry for ourselves, and that's doing nothing. Esther is pointing us, this is how you see the hand of God move. Do something. And if you're doing something, the best example I can give of this is the Apostle Paul. When he was Saul of Tarsus, he was one mean man. He was kicking down doors. He was hauling off Christians, blowing up families, throwing these individuals in jail and prison. They were being tortured to death sometimes. He was not a nice man. But you know what? To his credit, he was doing something. And a man who is doing something can always be redirected by God to doing it in a good direction. Don't give up and don't just bury your head in the sand. I don't know what to do. Do something. Two simple words, but they're very powerful. Now let me give you a verse that kind of provides a scriptural background for what I just told you. Proverbs 25 verse 2 says, "It is the glory of God to conceal a thing, but the honor of kings is to search out a matter." What God is saying is, I'll help you when I see you doing something. I'm going to hide from you the solution. And it is your glory to pick up a shovel and start digging, trying to find my solution. Look again at that 6-day war between Israel and Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq. God did a bunch of miracles for his people after Israel took the first shot. Preacher, why in the world would they attack a combined force twice its size? $12 Israeli tanks taking on an entire division of tanks? Are they nuts? Do you know what that's called? Doing something. And it was after they did something that God then pulled out the miracles to show the world, even lost people, I'm still here. God loves to perform miracles, but he will first make us put in a lot of effort, and then he will do that which we cannot do. So what did Esther do that prompted God to do something for her in return? She somehow found out that a financial arrangement had been made between her husband and Haman that involved selling all of the Jews. She again somehow found out that this deal involved not the enslaving of the Jews, but a nationwide slaughter. She also somehow got a financial expert to look at this great deal that Haman had cooked up and realized that it was not such a great deal for the king. It was not such a great deal for the kingdom. And according to Esther's own homework that she did, this is going to result in the king's damage. Now notice that I kept saying that she found out these things somehow. The reason I say that is because the Bible doesn't tell us how she did it. The Bible only tells us that once she found out, she chose to do what she possibly could. She chose to do something. And by doing that, she put God in a position where he could then do the rest. Verse number 5. She allowed God to control the conversation. She didn't force this. She was patient. She waited until just the right time. And lo and behold, she's put in a position where she's not bringing anything up. She's simply answering the questions of her husband. Verse 5, then the king Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, who is he? Where is he that durst presume in his heart to do so? And Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. Esther had been guarding her lips and patiently waiting for the right time. And then it happened. The king wanted to know, who is this person? The king wanted to know, where is he right now? And with the king now very interested in what Esther had to say, she answered his questions directly and fully. And she refused to be intimidated by Haman, even though he was sitting right next to her. And not only that, what did she have to lose? All the Jews are going to be killed anyway. What did she have to lose? Why bother trying to be nice and kind to Haman, because the decree had already been signed and there was nothing to lose at this point. And so she's asked, who is he? Where is he? He's sitting right next to you. Where did she find the courage to say this? How did she know what the right words were? Let me take you back to another scripture. Matthew 10 verse 19 says, but when they deliver you up, take no thought how or what ye shall speak. For it shall be given you in the same hour what ye shall speak, for it is not ye that speak, but the Spirit of your Father which speaketh in you. Don't lose any sleep over it. What you need to do is you need to spend the time and pay the price to climb up into God's lap, and he'll take over from there. Verse number 7. Number 5 tonight, she allowed truth to do its job. And the king, arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, went into the palace garden. Now this is where we lose a lot of people, because the truth can be scary. Sometimes people are not sure how people might respond to the truth, and therefore they're afraid of it, and they'll sometimes either try to hide it or change it. Why would they do that? Because they don't trust God to handle the truth, which he is very, very interested in, to handle that truth in a proper fashion. Now let me put a human face on King Xerxes if I could. And I want to kind of go dig him up and bring him back and put him in the auditorium and make him like kind of one of us, to understand what's going through his mind. Why is he storming out of the palace and rushing out into the garden? First of all, I think he was embarrassed. He was supposed to be a good judge of character. He's the king. He's making the big decisions for the kingdom. Ahasuerus is supposed to be smarter than the average bear. So why did he promote Haman to be the prime minister? Second most powerful man in the kingdom if he was really a snake in the grass. This did not make the king look very good. Notice the king did not try to defend Haman. He didn't try to argue with Esther at all. He heard the truth. And when he did, all of the little pieces started moving together, and he was starting to see a picture that he had not seen before. And now that he's looking at the truth, he's really feeling kind of foolish. The king had made a first greater mistake in allowing flattery to cloud his judgment. Another reason why he stormed out, he was shocked. You mean you're a Jew? My wife is a Jew? How did I not know this? They've been married now for at least 3 years. How is it possible that the king did not even know that he was married to a Jew? Kings are supposed to be well informed. They're supposed to have eyes in the back of their head. And now the king is coming to grips with the fact that he had made Esther the queen without even realizing who she was. Number 3, he stormed out because he was angry. According to Esther, this arrangement that Haman had presented to him, it was supposed to be a financial windfall, kind of a good deal for the king, or at least that's what he had been led to believe. Yeah, things were tight in the kingdom, and he really could use the money. His war with the Greeks had gotten out of hand. They had spent a whole lot more money. He needed money in a bad way. And yeah, it sounded at the beginning like it was a lot of money that was going to be paid out by Haman. But according to Esther and her accountant, this was going to damage the king financially even more so. And when you throw money into the mix, we're talking anger. One last reason why I think that the king stormed out of the palace, because he was confused. What was he going to do? How's he going to clean up this mess? I'm sure that going through his mind was this thought that he's going to be the laughing stock of the kingdom for the rest of his life because he had been fooled and swindled by this wicked Haman. Well, what could he do? With these mixed emotions, Xerxes bolted through the door to get alone with his thoughts. And unfortunately, that's all that a lost person can do. God is not a part of their life. A spiritual solution is not even on their radar. All they can do is allow these mixed emotions to turn their life into a raving volcano. Verse number 8. Circle the word fallen in this verse. The sixth thing tonight is this: she trusted God with the circumstances. Then the king returned out of the palace garden into the palace of the banquet of wine, and Haman was fallen upon the bed whereon Esther was. Back in 1992, President George Herbert Walker Bush was our president. He had traveled to Japan to make some kind of a diplomatic trip. He's sitting at the head table in a banquet hall where there's about 1,500 people present. He's sitting there eating his dinner, enjoying his time, outwardly at least, with the Prime Minister of Japan sitting next to him. All of a sudden, he looked at the Prime Minister He leaned toward him as if to say something, and right when he got real close, he threw up. All over the prime minister. As if that wasn't bad enough. After vomiting on the prime minister, he then passed out. His wife jumps up, grabbing a napkin, trying to clean up the vomit. A Secret Service agent jumps over the table, not knowing what in the world the problem is. After a couple of minutes, our president stood up and smiled to the crowd, wiping his face off, and showing everybody that he was feeling okay. Well, the prime minister, I'm sure, was wondering, now what am I going to wear? Now, here's the problem. President Bush was getting ready for one of the primaries. I think it was the state of New Hampshire. And the whole world was yucking it up about him chucking it up. It was on Saturday Night Live. It was on a lot of the news outlets. There's videos out there that show him doing this. The people in Japan, they loved it. Thought it was hilarious. In fact, they coined a new term called Bush Saru. What's that mean? It means to throw up in public. It was to do that Bush thing. Haman didn't plan for it to happen. He would never have dreamed that it could happen. But when the king stormed out, and he starts pleading for his life with Esther, and she wanted to get as far away from this jerk as she possibly could, she got up from the table, went over, sat on the sofa, and Haman, wanting to plead for his life, started rushing after her, and he tripped on the rug. Landed, spread eagle, on top of the queen. Right in time for the king to come back. Who says, trying to force my wife, huh? That's all he said. And the servants knew what to do. Over the head. Haman's escorted out. It's called perfect timing. Do you know what? It wasn't the rug that tripped Haman. It was that invisible hand of God, bringing about his will through a very unusual circumstance. Esther didn't plan for that to happen. She didn't have to. She was doing something, and God got busy, helping out as needed. Verse number 8 again. Last thing tonight is this. She knew when to keep quiet. Then the king returned out of the palace garden into the palace of the banquet of wine, and Haman was fallen upon the bed whereon Esther was. Then said the king, will he force the queen also before me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. A famous Chinese general called Sun Tzu had this to say about warfare. Never interrupt the enemy when he is making a mistake. When your enemy is doing something that's really stupid, don't attack. Let him continue to do whatever it is that's really stupid. A modern day expression is to give a man enough rope so that he can hang himself. The idea is that when things are moving in the right direction, get out of the way so that they can continue moving in the right direction. The king stormed out in a rage. He's angry, he's confused, he's feeling guilty and looking for some kind of a solution. And then he comes back into the palace. And when he re-enters this room, here's Haman laying on top of his wife. And then the light comes on. Oh, you're forcing my wife, huh? Now let me ask you this. Do you really think that the king thought that? I don't. Do you really think that Esther thought that Haman was trying to rape her while the king's outside in the garden? I don't. So what did Esther do when the king chose to use this current situation as his solution for getting rid of Haman? She zipped the lid. Not even a peep. This was not part of her plan, but it sure looked like God had a plan of his own. What was God's plan? It's a simple one. It's called sowing and reaping. Like when Jacob lied to his father about his brother Esau, and then years later, Jacob's sons lied to him about Joseph. Like when David killed Uriah the Hittite, and then years later, 3 of his own sons were killed as well. It's a law that's as basic as planting a kernel of corn and being real confident of what's going to grow out of the ground. Because you reap what you sow. It is a law that is not well liked, but it doesn't have to be liked to be true. Haman despised a good man, and even though he thinks that he is good, he's now despised himself. He built a gallows for Mordecai, and now he is the one who's going to be using it. Now, this sowing and reaping thing, is that a bad law for God to have? Actually, it's a great law. You know why? Because when you sow good things, you're going to reap good things. This is a wonderful thing. Folks, do you realize tonight that there is a law God has placed in this world? That law is going to operate 24 hours a day. People do not have to see you doing good for you to be treated good in return, because there is a law that will not vary, and the law is you will reap what you sow. In the privacy of your own heart, when you make a decision to do something that is good, you can do it anonymously. And there's a God in heaven that has put a great law in this world, and that law is when you sow good things, I'm going to make sure that you really have a nice harvest. Let's bow for prayer. Father, would you bless your people tonight? Holy Spirit, thank you for every person that chose to be in this auditorium tonight. Because of their faithfulness, Holy Spirit, would you please bless them abundantly this week? They came to church this week. I'm asking, would you please bless them this week because they chose to be here? And Holy Spirit, I pray that you'd help us to get excited about the Bible tonight. We can read it from a historical vantage point and scratch our heads wondering, how does this fit